Lake Superior. Majestic, isolated, aloof. Along with her sister, she is part of an inland sea trapped 1,500 miles inside the North American continent. Its waters are always icy, its violence sudden and severe. Fogs and sudden storms sweep over its waters. Shoals and sandbars lay in wait to snare the unwary. Its ancient waters hold many secrets and stories. Along its southern shore lies a remote and unforgiving place. A place all sailors of the lakes fear. A place called the Shipwreck Coast. Anyone who has seen Lake Superior knows it deserves awe and respect. As large as all of Ireland, it could flood the lower 48 states of America to a depth of more than 2 feet. It takes 200 years just to fully replenish its huge water reservoir. The storms that sweep its shores, created on the North American plains, can quickly churn the waters into tremendous seas across its 300-mile length. And the barren coastline offers little to those who survive its chilling surf.
At certain seasons, the lake is visited by violent gales which throw their fresh water into furious convulsions with a suddenness unknown upon the sea. Vessels unable to hold their own against the severity of these storms, being landlocked and with scant sea room, are likely to be left with the only choice between stranding wherever they may be driven or seeking refuge in the harbor that seems most accessible. Sumner Kimball, Chief Superintendent, United States Lifesaving Service.
Superior was the last of the Great Lakes to be open to navigation, since its only outlet, the St. Mary's River, was too shallow and swift for navigation. With the completion of the locks at Sault Ste. Marie in 1885, shipping exploded onto the lake. Copper, grain, timber, and later iron ore flowed out of the ports along the lake's coast. Immigrants and coal came upbound to fuel the expansion of settlements, mines, and lumber camps. But any ship entering or leaving the lake had to pass the southern coast. More than 100 ships have met their doom here, some by collision in confined shipping lanes, but most by the hidden spider's web of sandbars and shoals, waiting for a storm to drive a helpless ship to its doom.
If you take a look at the topography of Lake Superior, you look at the harbors of refuge along the way. When ships traverse Lake Superior, which is 300 and some odd miles across, there are very few places to hide, especially from Whitefish Point west for about 80 miles.
The terrain there is basically wide open beach. It's sand, and it's a very unforgiving sand. Offshore, several hundred yards, you have a series of sandbars that shift and move. So the vessels that were downbound on Lake Superior, or upbound and following the coast, would frequently hit these sandbars, either through navigation error or blown onto them because of the prevailing winds.
In all the navigation on Lake Superior, there is none more dreaded by the mariner than that from Whitefish Point to Grand Island. And this is especially the case late in the season when fall storms make navigation the most hazardous. Exposed to every wind that blows from the lake, there is not at present a single place where a landing can be made, or a lake steamer run for safety in the whole distance. This beach is strewed with wrecks from Pictured Rocks to Whitefish Point. John DiSterno, Lake Superior Guide, 1872.
With no harbors of refuge and no lights to guide them, sailors grope blindly through the gales, hoping to get further out to sea and avoid this 60 miles of barren coastline. For those unfortunate enough not to make the shelter of Whitefish Bay in a gale, the possibility of disaster was not far off. If the ship grounded and was being pounded by the waves, there was little to do but pray.
On Lake Superior, you have relatively shallow waters, so the seas build rapidly, but the waves are very close together, very choppy. That doesn't mean they don't get large. They do get very large, but they're very close together. So a ship really doesn't roll with the surf. They get beat by the waves.
And that meant that your ship was offshore several hundred yards and beginning to break up under you. And your ability then to try and make it through that surf was very, very questionable. If you survived the shipwreck on Lake Superior, the single factor that you had to overcome to survive was cold. They ended up on the life rafts, on the lifeboats, and they just died from the cold.
The icy waters, the remoteness of the coastline, along with the many wrecks, provoked public outcry, forcing Congress to appropriate money for lighthouses across Superior.
There weren't any lights on the lake prior to 1849, but shipping had been there since the early 1800s. So Horace Greeley, actually, who took a trip across Lake Superior, could not believe there weren't any lights on the lake, and he heard about all the shipwrecks and he saw the nasty weather and with no lights to guide them.
Every month's delay is virtual manslaughter, yet the executive pays men to air their uniforms at Sault Ste. Marie in absurd uselessness and leaves the lighthouse till another season. Horace Greeley, New York Tribune, 1846.
His letter-writing campaign and his editorials that he wrote in his newspaper brought congressional attention to the fact that we needed lights. Lake Superior was totally dark. Whitefish Point was the first light established in 1849 to mark the critical turning point for vessels entering or leaving the lake.
After the Whitefish Point light, a light was established at the opposite end of the coast at Ensemble Point in 1874. Isolated and often poorly provisioned, these lighthouses tested the endurance of the men and women who lived there.
That lighthouse was isolated. It was about 25 miles from the nearest community. The families that lived there survived through the season. They survived the winter. They certainly did not flourish. There was one family that buried two small children just several hundred yards behind the lighthouse in the graveyard because the children had died from a disease. There was no medical attention, and the best they could do was to give the child a burial. And situations like that, examples like that, are certainly throughout the entire lighthouse service. It was tough duty. This was not a romantic period in our history.
True, people did the job because it was a steady paying job, but if you got sick, you took care of yourself. If your children got sick, you took care of them too. Many children have died at lighthouses. I fail to see why that would be romantic at all.
While the construction of the Whitefish and Ensemble lights did help sailors in navigating the waters, they rarely helped the many ships and crew which foundered between them. The losses of life became appalling. Sumner Kimball pressed the Treasury Department for more funds to establish life-saving stations across Superior. 4 of the initial 5 were situated on the Shipwreck coast.
The life-saving stations on Lake Superior were introduced in 1875 out of necessity, and they were introduced to Lake Superior like every 10 miles. We had a life-saving station at Vermilion, which is 9 or 10 miles west of here. The next one was 5 miles beyond that, believe it, because it was really a treacherous area at Crisp Point. Then we had one at Deer Park, and then we had one at Grand Marais, and so on down the lake.
At the station there would have been the keeper, who was a year-round employee, and then the men were recruited basically each year, and the most qualified man was number 1, and number 2 right on down to number 7 being the newest man. If you look in the bunk room right above their closet, there would be a number, and if You knew exactly where your bed and your closet was once you got your rank. The keeper of the station was permitted to live with his family, so his wife and family members would have been there, and they had about half the station for their private quarters. The other men, of about half of the crew, may have been married. The men were required to live in the station and be there at night, but the married men often built small cottages nearby for their families so they could see them in their off hours.
For surfmen, long watches, slim paychecks, and poor food weeded out the adventure seeker and the unfit. Along the shipwreck coast, you could add loneliness to that list. The reputation of the station at Vermilion Point was particularly well known.
The station at Vermilion, Michigan was often called a Little Alcatraz by the Coast Guard personnel that were stationed there after the lifesavers had left. And they called it that because of the tremendous remoteness of that station, about 40 miles from the nearest civilization.
When I first went there, we were 70 miles from the closest doctor or dentist. We were 40 miles from the closest grocery store. We were completely snowed in all winter, usually from the 1st of November through May. During the winter, the last 10 miles into Vermilion, with its many hills and gullies, would have drifts of snow from 10 to 20 feet deep. One job the Coast Guard crew had in the winter was to keep the telephone lines in repair along the beach from one station to another. Many times when the lines were down in the winter, the men had to shovel down to find the lines. Myrtle Call, wife of surfman Kenneth Call, Lifesaving Station Number 9, Vermilion Point, Michigan.
The Vermilion Point station was basically kind of the end of the world. Except for that small cluster of men and their families, it was a pretty isolated shoreline.
The station at Crisp's Point, named for its first keeper, Christopher Crisp, had a lighthouse added in 1904. This may have buoyed the spirits of those at the life-saving station when it was constructed, but in 1892, it still was an isolated outpost.
A wilder-looking place than the last at Vermilion. Tall, somber fir and pine trees in gloomy ranks reared their heads beside the silent lake for miles away. The station house and 2 or 3 cabins standing in the clearing beside it had a lonesome look on the edge of the endless forest. Reverend W.H. Law, 1892.
The station has been claimed by Superior since that day. Only the light tower remains to mark the desolate shore. It too may soon disappear. It is one of the most endangered of all Great Lakes lighthouses. In remote locations like Crisp's Point, it could be difficult for a station keeper to maintain discipline. Sometimes they went to extreme lengths to keep the already hardy outdoorsmen in line.
Some people have pointed out that the life-saving service keeper, the man in charge, were very strict. Some of them were extremely strict. They ran it like it was a military organization, or maybe a better way of saying that they ran it like they were a captain on a ship. And in fact, the keepers were sometimes called captain. There was a reason for this. You had to have discipline to make a rescue. It has also been said that in the early years, especially Lake Superior, a lot of the crews were very rowdy, and you needed a man that could, in fact, beat anybody in that crew.
Our visit to Captain Morgan's station was accompanied by the unpleasant feature of a sort of mutiny among the crew. The trouble seemed to have arisen out of the keeper's insistence on discipline and strict performance of duty. This was irksome to those wild and free spirits of the forest, and they were making things very uncomfortable for the keeper. They refused to get into the surf boat when Captain Morgan ordered it for our departure. When we did get off, the old captain carried a pistol in his shirt and a hatchet in the stern beside him. It was a specimen of the kind of life he had always led in this place. Reverend W.H. Law, Deer Park Visitor, 1891.
Keepers like Morgan, O'Shea, and Cleary knew that the monotony of life on the shore could lead to grumbling from the crew. They drilled the men daily to keep their hands and minds busy. Respected for their accomplishments, they were nevertheless derided for their strict adherence to regulations. It was necessary but grueling work.
When you got out there and it was pitch black and the wind was blowing, the sand was stinging your face and you could barely keep your eyes open, it was important that everybody was trained to know exactly how to assist each other and could work together as a team.
To get an idea of what it would be like to be a lifesaver on Lake Superior, you could get yourself dressed in oilskins, sit in a rocking chair and start rocking, have your house cool to about 40 degrees, and then have somebody take a bucket of water and throw it in your face about every 2 minutes.
These experiences were remembered by an anonymous surfman of the Great Lakes in a poem that was passed from station to station.
And always on Tuesday we take out the surf boat and pull with a will about 2 miles from shore. And then we pull back against headwind and current while we listen to Hanson's wild howl and his roar. Oh, it's fun and a pleasure at midnight to shiver and think of the lookout that's up overhead, and glad you were snug and warm under your kiver, the thing on the top of your own little bed. If you want to have lots of fun and enjoyment, come down for a while to this beautiful place, for here you can take Father Time by the whiskers and gauge his angelic face. All things come so easy and go in the same way. Oh, don't for Christ's sake your own dear back break in that lead-colored station, that government station, that life-saving station that stands by the lake.
For those who survived the low pay, the poor food, and the many days where monotony was the enemy, a pride arose about their ability to persevere when action demanded it.
The men that were attracted to the old life-saving service were really a very varied lot. There were lumberjacks, there were fishermen, there were small boat handlers, there were some men that were sailors off the lake boats. All of them, I think, had one characteristic in common, or they didn't last as a lifesaver, and that was their tremendous sense of duty, coupled with the bravery that they displayed almost daily, not only during the actual rescue, but when they were out there rehearsing and practicing in the teeth of the same kind of weather and the same storms that they would face during an actual rescue.
In the early days of the life-saving service, the constant training was done without the aid of modern machinery. The surfmen of the Great Lakes called it Norwegian steam, manpower.
All the equipment was designed that it could be operated by just men. You could hitch a horse to a beach apparatus, but if you didn't have a horse around, you could always drag it by yourself. It's the same thing with the surf boats. They were designed to be dragged across a beach and launched into the surf. Everything's man-powered.
Not every shipwreck was right in front of your house, so they might have to haul the equipment a mile or 5 miles or 10 or 15 miles down the beach to the side of the shipwreck. So it could be a major effort, and the fellows could be nearly exhausted by the time they actually got to the site.
Even if there were no drills or rescues, there were always 24 hours of watch duty and the evening beach patrols to be performed.
They needed to sleep at the station during the night because they had duties during the night to get up and go on beach patrol or to stand lookout in the tower when it was their turn. The beach patrol was every night, and sometimes in the daytime when there was inclement weather. If it was foggy or raining hard, they'd continue the beach patrol into the daytime.
They figured that beach patrols between life-saving stations could meet one another and literally cover the shoreline, especially along the shipwreck coast.
Now, in our modern world, that looks like, or sounds like that'd be a great thing. Walk along the beach at a nice night, some moon shining. But try that in November on Lake Superior, when the wind is coming across and the sleet is on you and the waves are still pounding at you, and it becomes a different story. It took a lot of work just to do beach patrols.
The hardships involved in these protracted marches while all the world lies comfortably in bed have no parallel in the employment of any other class of men. The beaches are often clad with ice, and at the best are pathless deserts in the night, and when lashed by storms are frequently cloven through with new inlets, while hills of sand are rent and torn away as the surf leaps furiously beyond its normal limits. Martha J. Lamb, Scribner's Magazine, 1882.
One Vermilion surfman on beach patrol encountered seas running 100 feet up the beach on a bitter cold night. The water would become ice before another wave would arrive, causing him to slip and fall. Crawling on his hands and knees, he almost perished in the frigid weather.
Far from the station and sick from the flu, he had been wading through the snow, and becoming exhausted, severe cramps set in, and he could not reach the 4-mile post, but was compelled to lie down on the beach and remain there until the next patrol came along and found him. The men turned out and got him home, and under proper treatment saved his life. Reverend W.H. Law, 1902.
Many times, surfmen on their long patrols, or sometimes a lightkeeper just out for some exercise along the shore, came across items in the sand. Often it was cargo washed overboard. Sometimes it was the wreckage of ships gone missing. And far too often, it was bodies from a sinking in Superior's cold depths. Many of these unknown victims were buried where they were found.
When I was a wee girl, my grandfather had several graves he tended. Now, he didn't know these people from a hole in the ground. What was important was the fact that they were there. So he would take me by the hand, and in the other hand, of course, he had a rake. And there was 2 graves there of adults. From the weather and the washing of the water, and the bones would come up. And Granddad would sit there very quietly and match them. And then he would rebury them.
Along the shipwreck coast, the discovery of bodies after a wreck, either in the fall of the year or the following spring, was very common. They would usually be found by the patrolling lifesavers who might see some hair or an arm, perhaps even coming out of the sand. The body would be recovered. Every effort would be made to try and identify it, but in many cases it was a mission impossible. So the remains would be buried either at the station graveyard, if there was one, or across dunes on the shoreward side. And that burial would always be done very reverently. Even today, occasionally, if you walk the shipwreck coast, as the erosion occurs, human remains will become visible.
This harrowing but not unusual practice of coming upon the dead led the old-timers of the Vermilion Station to concoct long, bearded stories for new arrivals who were going out on their first beach patrols. In the 1920s, a novice was told the yarn of Three Fingers Riley. As the story goes, a sailor named Riley had been found frozen in the ice along Superior shoreline. A surfman had carelessly chopped off 2 of the sailor's fingers while trying to free his body from the ice. From that point on, it was said, the ghost of Riley walked up and down the beach, searching for his missing fingers. The novice was given his lantern and pointed out into the darkness. At the Deer Park Station in August of 1892, surfman Benjamin Trudell slept before his scheduled midnight patrol. Superior was kicking up a raging storm, and Trudell tossed in his cot as the wind howled and sand beat against the windows. We don't know whether surfman Trudell ever met Three Fingers Riley, but he was about to have a most unusual dream.
At midnight, when I was awakened to go on my patrol, I leapt from my cot, trembling and perspiring. I had been dreaming about a wreck and still fancied myself on the beach. The delusion persisted in spite of my comrades surrounding me, dressed in oilskins, carrying lanterns, and in the familiar surroundings. I had dreamed I was walking down the beach through the storm, and I had not gone far before I became aware of another presence. It was a well-dressed man, obviously someone of position.
And the man walked up to him and looked him straight in the eyes with a great pleading look on his face. Said nothing, but just a great pleading look of help. And then he just disappeared.
The other surfmen jeered at this story, but the next day the station lookout spotted a sailor staggering toward the Deer Park station. His name was Harry Stewart, and he was the wheelman of the 2-year-old 300-foot steamer Western Reserve. When dried and warm, Stewart told of the last moments of the ship. He said that the Reserve had locked through at Sault Ste. Marie the previous afternoon. Her owner, Captain Peter Minch, and his family were aboard for a summer cruise. She had been sailing light and encountered a gale just off Whitefish Point. At about 9 p.m., there was a sudden shock. When the crew was told to investigate the cause, it was found that the Reserve had split amidships and was rapidly sinking. All aboard were ordered to the lifeboats. As they neared shore, first one boat and then another capsized in the heavy surf.
The people in the lifeboat from the ship did have great difficulty. About 7 a.m., they reached the breakers off Deer Park. The lifeboat tumbled, and it tumbled, and it tumbled. As the people began to come to the beach, one by one, they drowned.
Wheelman Stewart found himself alone, battling the waves for over 2 hours.
I saw none of the occupants after I started for the shore. But the cries of the children, the screams of the women, and the moaning of the men were terrible for a few moments. Then all was silent. Wheelman Stewart, Western Reserve.
Of course, the keeper at the station immediately put his crew on the beach to see if they could locate any survivors or at the very least recover the bodies. Benjamin Trudell, of course, went out as part of the crew.
The men of the Deer Park station searched the shore for any other survivors and to keep the ever-present wolves from claiming those who had perished. Eventually, 16 of the 21 aboard were found. The station keeper, Quentin Morgan, came across Captain Minch's little daughter.
The little girl, 12 years of age, was found in a perfect state of preservation and beautiful even in death. Tears filled my eyes so that I could scarcely see. She lay there alone on that desolate shore, with her skirts and hair partly covered with sand, as though she had been a little angel hovering over the scene of desolation and sorrow, and then had lost her way and been cast ashore. We knew that relatives would come to claim their bodies. We took the measurements of each one, made note of the manner of clothes, the color of hair and eyes, and general features. And then we placed them in separate graves in the dry sand up a safe distance from the beach. Somehow we could not bury any of them without a prayer. And you know, that is not my line. Well, what I could not do, some of the men could, and they helped me out. And so we managed among us to have a little prayer over each one that we buried. Quentin Morgan, Deer Park Station Keeper, 1892.
Surfman Trudell discovered another body, that of an older man who had an expensive pocket watch. Its inscription told him that this was Captain Minch.
And as he turned the body over in the wash of the sea, it was the same man that had come to Benjamin in the dream. The exact same man. And Benjamin, always afterward, wondered, was this an effort in his dream of the spirit of Minch to reach out? And Trudell, of course, never knew.
By 1915, when the Lifesaving Service merged with the Revenue Cutter Service into the new Coast Guard, the Shipwreck Coast had claimed another 32 ships. But it wasn't for lack of vigilance. The lights had continued to turn, and the patrols, drills, and watches went on as before. After years of exemplary service, Benjamin Trudell was promoted to keeper of the Grand Marais Station. Robert Carlson, keeper of the Whitefish Point Light, witnessed the marriage of his daughter Cecilia to Ora Endress, who owned a small fishery and a few boats just south of the lighthouse. She bore him a daughter, Bertha, in 1910. Besides fishing, Ora and his father Emil ran small boats up and down the southern coast, providing provisions and mail to the scattered settlements and government outposts. Their visits were always welcomed by the inhabitants, breaking the monotony and isolation of day-to-day life.
It is difficult to explain adequately the sensations of those who had been shut in from the world from December until May, when the smoke of the first steamer was seen far off on the horizon, before the hull of the steamer could be seen making its way through the ice. And it was the luxury of fresh eggs, fresh meat and vegetables, after the salt pork, the salt beef, and dried foods of winter. No one knows the delight of fresh eggs until after such an experience. William H. Steele, 1880.
Like most Superior seamen, the Endress men always pushed for one more load, one more trip before winter closed in and ice gripped the lake. They had lost the Betha Endress, along with 5 of her crew off Whitefish Point in 1891, and then Ora was caught in a gale off Grand Marais in 1912. His boat, the South Shore, began to take on water, and the ice freezing topside threatened to take her down. Trudell's crew saw the boat's distress and put to sea, plucking the 14 passengers and Ora off the South Shore before she was driven west and wrecked near Osabo Point. A third boat, named after Ora, was in trouble just off Whitefish Point 2 years later, in September of 1914. William Jones, piloting the Ora Endress, and the 10 people on board were caught in a gale and capsized at about 5:30 in the afternoon. Keeper Carlson observed the sinking and called the Vermilion Lifesavers, who immediately put to sea for the rescue.
Well, in the meantime, the assistants came out, and some of the fishermen came over from the dock. They all tried to get Grandpa's boat from the bay side over to the Superior side, and it was a horrible storm, just awful. Well, they dragged and they puffed on that thing, and then they couldn't get it just so far, and then it stopped, and the rollers wouldn't work. The next thing they knew, the boat started up again, and they looked around, and Grandmother grabbed a hold of the boat. Well, then Grandpa asked for volunteers to go, and there was about 15, 20 fishermen there. 2 fellas stepped forward, and they rowed the boat while Grandpa steered it, and they saved every single one of the men.
Station keeper Carpenter and the Vermilion crew arrived within an hour. Seeing a light waving on the shore, the crew immediately headed for it. As they beached, they could see Lightkeeper Carlson and his volunteers had taken matters into their own hands and recovered the crew of the Ora Endress. In May of 1919, Ora and Emil Endress contacted the Vermilion Lifesavers to see if they could help them raise the boat, which was still underwater just offshore. The station keeper, McGaw, grudgingly agreed, and the crew, along with the aid of a tug, raised the old boat. Mr. Endress expressed his gratitude, and the crew returned to the station cold and wet from their experience. McGaw noted that all they received were some severe colds for their hard work. When Ora brought his boat into Grand Marais 2 months later, the cold was almost unbearable. Temperatures were well below zero, and snowstorm after snowstorm battered the little harbor town. Along the Shipwreck coast, it was the only refuge for 30 miles in either direction, but the captains and shipping companies risked angering the November witch by continuing to sail for that last load, that last trip of the season.
I don't know why the government bothers to have us up here. These damn sailors pay no attention to us. If you put up a storm warning in Nantucket, the boats stay in port until the storm blows out. On the lakes, they take one look at the weather forecast and then forget it. Alexander Burns, Station Chief, U.S. Weather Bureau, Sault Ste. Marie.
Superior had dodged the worst of the huge 4-day storm of 1913 that claimed over 20 ships on the lakes. But this year, she would claim 4 ships, cripple another, and take 38 sailors' lives within days. The steamer John Owen was to be the first. Clearing the Keweenaw Peninsula to the west of the coast on the 12th of November, Captain Benham and his 21-man crew went missing. The only trace was a solitary board with the name of the ship on it, found later that week. Like so many others on Superior's November waters, his boat fell through what sweetwater mariners call a crack in the lake. The same Arctic blast that claimed the Owen moved east and now assaulted the H.E. Reynolds just off Grand Marais. Her captain, Hugh O'Hagan, had struggled west from Whitefish Point the previous day. He was lucky enough to reach the shelter of Grand Marais with her load of coal by the evening of the Owen's demise. When the wind subsided the next day, O'Hagan set out again, but was caught in a renewed blow. Winds of 60 miles per hour and blinding snow forced him back from just off Osavo Point and back toward Grand Marais. At dawn, Captain O'Hagan had the crew stoke the Reynolds boiler and made an attempt at the harbor. Normally, Benjamin Trudell would be fully attentive to the steamer's distress, but he was away on leave, down with the influenza that swept the country that year. It was up to his first surfman to decide the fate of the Reynolds crew. His terse entries in the station log only hint at what was to be one of the most dramatic rescues of the coast.
Station log, November 14th, 1919. Benjamin Trudell away on 10-day leave. First surfman A.E. Christofferson reporting. 5:30 a.m. Surfman George Olson on lookout reported steamer on wrong side of West Pier at harbor entrance. Wind increased to whole gale and snowing heavily. Number 1 surfman went over to submarine chaser number 438, which was in harbor for shelter.
When Christofferson saw the wreck beginning to happen, and the crew at the station could watch the events develop and see what the inevitable result would be, Christofferson went down to the harbor, where he met with the captain of a U.S. Coast Guard subchaser that was anchored there from the storm, and asked the captain, a fellow by the name of O'Connor, if Christofferson could borrow some of his crewmen, because he's had a rescue upcoming, some of his own men were sick, he needed some volunteers.
Also on board was keeper John Anderson of the Chicago Coast Guard Station and friend of Captain O'Connor. He agreed to take charge. They headed back to the station to prepare for the rescue.
We got to within 1,000 feet of the station when we suddenly saw the steamer close to the shore on the wrong side of the pier. She began blowing distress signals as soon as they saw how close they were to shore. It was snowing very heavily at the time, and visibility was very short. The steamer struck, broadside to the seas, which rapidly broke her to pieces.
They watch the ship hit the reef, hit the sandbar. Their motor lifeboat, which they would have preferred to try and get out to the wreck in, a 36-foot motor lifeboat, was disabled. That left the crew only with the option of using the beach apparatus.
With the engine of the motor lifeboat seized, Anderson had them bring the Lyle gun and beach cart to the edge of the water. They fired a line to the ship, and the Reynolds crew tied off the line to the ship's wheel. But in the cold, the rope froze and then snarled, rendering it useless for a shore rescue. Anderson then called for the smaller surfboat. Tying loops in the bow and stern around the frozen rope, it was now to become a rail, bringing the lifeboat to the sinking Reynolds. The rescuers just hoped it would hold long enough to get to the marooned crew.
Then Christofferson and Anderson and the rest of the crew got in the surfboat and rowed out to the wreck to make the rescue. But on the way out, the waves are so vicious and the surf so strong that 4 of the lifesavers are washed out of the lifeboat and only with great difficulty come back in. They managed to make the trip. They pick up some of the crew, get them ashore. They repeat that same terrible journey 4 times.
During this ordeal, Keeper Anderson was washed overboard 3 times. and the life-saving crew was so exhausted after the third trip that they were replaced by a sailor from the Subchaser and 4 Grand Marais civilians.
Lifesavers are injured, volunteers are injured, local fishermen take their places, some of the crew from the Subchaser are injured. All of them suffer terribly. Each time it was swamped by the waves, the ice began to build on the lifeboat. And you can imagine what was happening to the men that were in the lifeboat. When the last rescue was completed, the last crew member brought ashore, the men literally had to be chopped out of the boat because they were frozen in from the effects of the ice and the cold water. But the end result was the life-saving crew were able to make a tremendous rescue against all odds by refusing to say no. If the surf boat didn't work, we're going to try the breeches buoy. If that doesn't work the way it's intended to work, then we're going to modify it and make it work with the surf boat. And they were able to recover and save the entire crew of the steamer, which after the last man came ashore, very rapidly began to come apart and soon was reduced to kindling.
After all persons were saved, several surfmen were ordered to bed, others already being there. No patrols were made during the night. Summoned physician to treat sick surfmen at station. No liberty granted on account of wreck. Hired team of horses to bring back boats and apparatus to station from beach. Received 1 parcel of stationery from District Superintendent. A.E. Christopherson, temporarily in charge, Station 296, Grand Marais, Michigan.
All of those involved in removing the crew of the Runnels, both official and civilian, were awarded the Gold Life-Saving Medal from the Coast Guard. One of the civilians who received the medal for the rescue was named Ora Endress. He had now repaid his debt to the life-saving service.
This rescue just demonstrated in such a tremendous fashion the ability of the surfmen to overcome all odds, to risk their own lives to save mariners in danger, the cooperation of the local community and their assistance, and just how the whole package comes together to make the rescue. And coupled with that was the idea that the life-saving service, the old crews, would never give up, they would never stop in the face of adversity. Always remembering the motto, regulations say we have to go out, they don't say anything about us coming back.
Superior sailors like Ora were a tough lot, battling not only weather, but also the clock. They did battle with the elements just as much as the lifesavers did, sometimes more.
The common denominator, of course, would be it's a hard life, it's a tough life. You're dealing with cold weather in the spring and the fall, you're dealing with the typical storms of spring and fall. You will always, at some point during that year, be fighting ice and ice devils and fog and storm. So, in summary, it just is a tough way to try and earn a living.
After the tremendous effort of the Grand Marais crew in rescuing the crew of the Runnels, Superior reached out again. This time, the Vermilion lifesavers were not quite as lucky as their brethren down the coast. The sailors of the old lumber hooker Myron weren't lucky at all. On November 22, 1919, just 1 week after the disaster of the Owen and the Runnels, Captain Neal and his steamer, the Myron, left Munising, Michigan, bound for the Sioux, after taking the schooner barge Miztec in tow.
They struck in a vicious north storm, and that storm began to churn the lake up to very, very high conditions. Off Vermilion Point, the 2 ships were in very serious difficulty. The Myron cut loose the schooner barge Mystic. Now, this was very typically done. The schooner barge would be able to lay to, to drop some anchors and to lay to in the waves and usually ride that storm out better than she could as a simple tow of the steamer. Well, the Myron continued on.
As the Miztec disappeared into the darkness, Captain Neal hoped that they would both be better able to weather the storm. Such was not to be the case.
Captain Neal was flying distress signals, hoping, beyond hope, of course, that he was going to make it, but letting the people know along the shore at Life-Saving Station number 9 at Vermilion, and hopefully people who had them under spyglass at Whitefish Point, that they were in serious trouble.
The Vermilion crew had spent the day on the freezing beach looking for survivors from the John Owen. As the two ships passed the life-saving station, the lookout alerted the keeper, and the life-saving crew scurried back to launch their surfboat in hopes of catching up with the slowly sinking Myron. All through the afternoon of the 22nd, the Myron crew battled the gale alone. The captain of the 440-foot steel steamer Adriatic, seeing the Myron's predicament, pulled alongside the old wooden boat, hoping to shelter it from the pounding of the lake. The two captains headed east, trying to reach shelter in the calmer waters of Whitefish Bay. But for the Myron, it was now hopeless. With the waters of Superior rising around them, Captain Neal ordered his crew to abandon ship. Captain McRae was helpless to come to their aid. The shallow waters of the coast had already caused the Adriatic to bottom out on 2 rescue attempts.
They were trying to get to our boat, and we tried to make a lee, to protect them, see? But we were loaded. We were about 8 foot, and the waves was going clean over the top of our boat, and it started to get worse, and the waves were picking up. It was up to 60 miles an hour winds, and I'd say 14, 16-foot waves. It was just like a house, And then the snowstorm, that you couldn't see a thing later. Just about dusk, that's when everything all happened.
As soon as they met the water, the lifeboats were lashed by fierce winds and waves filled with careening pieces of lumber. The captain of the Adriatic could only look on in despair as the small boats foundered in the wreckage.
They got in amongst that lumber and stuff like that, and then they disappeared about around dark. We couldn't see them no more. Just we could hear them faint voice that hollering for help and stuff like that, but that's it. And they were getting, numb and stuff like that from the cold, and it's just, you can't do it. You're helpless. You can't do a thing. You're there, and you just, poor fellas, they're going to die. They haven't got a chance.
Captain Neal stayed aboard the Myron, sitting in the darkness of the pilot house, hoping to somehow save his doomed ship. The men in the boats, nearing total exhaustion, fought for their lives in the darkness of the gale.
Well, about 1.5 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, the Myron gives up the ghost. Neal stayed in the pilot house till the ship literally dove for the bottom. But the act of diving caused the pilot house to pop loose from the deck of the vessel, with Neal still stuck within. Neal is able to climb out through a window to the roof of the pilot house, where he sits there literally waiting rescue.
Captain Neal, alone on his makeshift raft, saw the lights of the Adriatic disappear. But the lights of another steamer were approaching. It was the 550-foot ore carrier H.P. McIntosh. Coming to within 25 feet of Neal, her captain could have ordered a line tossed. Inexplicably, Captain Francis yelled to Neal that he would send a boat back for him. The McIntosh then turned and sailed into the night.
In the meantime, the 2 lifeboats with the crew of the Myron in them now is in the middle of this floating morass of lumber and junk from the boat and stuff and wood, and they can't get out. They're trapped.
We knew that they didn't have a chance. The conditions of the weather and everything, a blinding snowstorm and the huge waves.
The Vermilion life-saving crew pressed on into the darkness, but never saw Neal or any of his crew. Probing the large debris field for another 20 miles, they finally turned back and beached themselves at the Whitefish Point Light.
Sault Ste. Marie News, November 24th, 1919. Captain W.R. Neal, the only known survivor of the Myron, will arrive in this city late this afternoon on the steamer Franz, which rescued him after he had clung to the pilot house of his wrecked ship for nearly 20 hours as it floated in Lake Superior. It is now regarded that they most likely suffered the same fate as the crew of the John Owen, not one of whom lived to tell the story of the shipwreck.
Neil had suffered terribly through the entire incident. The cold had caused his fingers to swell to such a size that they completely covered his wedding band. He had suffered from frostbite, obviously from exposure, and afterwards, after his rescue, he never was the same man again and never commanded again on the Great Lakes. The crew, all 16 of them, died. They literally froze to death in the weather. And when their bodies were recovered eventually along the coast by the life-saving crews, they were found in some cases in some very grotesque shapes.
They chopped them out of the ice and they put them on the boat, the Sea Fox. And the bodies were caked in ice and they were sitting up against the pilot house, the back of the pilot house. And right today, when I close my eyes, I can see that sight.
The 16 men that left the Myron in her lifeboats were buried in a common grave at a small cemetery outside Brimley, Michigan. That next spring, 3 bodies from the sinking of the John Owen were found in Isle Parisienne, and 3 more near Crisps Point Station. One of the Vermilion surfmen found a 7th sailor frozen in the ice. After he was chipped out and searched, his name was found to be Riley, and he was missing 3 fingers. The Vermilion Point crews answered 1,003 calls between 1876 and 1935 and saved an estimated 900 lives. The Crisps Point, Deer Park, and Trudell's Grand Marais crews could boast similar statistics. But by the 1940s, things had begun to change dramatically on the Great Lakes. The ships became larger and fewer in number. Better navigation tools and weather forecasting cut the number of groundings and sinkings. Most of the life-saving stations around the lakes were slowly abandoned. The lighthouses were either automated, up for sale, or just dark. Modernization removed the men who stood watch and the women who stood with them along the shipwreck coast. It was the end of an era.
Over the past 200 years, we have seen a tremendous increase in safety on the Great Lakes. The large number of shipwrecks that were so prevalent a century ago, of course, are a thing of the past. And as we get bigger and as we get better, as our ships become stronger, navigational aids increase, we've seen a dramatic decline in shipwrecks. But we still see shipwrecks.
In November 1975, the 729-foot ore freighter Edmund Fitzgerald, Big Fitz to its crew, and her captain Edward McSorley set sail on its 40th voyage with 50 million pounds of iron ore in its hold. Like generations of ships before, it was trying to get in one last run before the winter's freeze. As she neared the eastern end of the lake, Superior was brewing a storm that was one of the worst on record. Winds of hurricane force lashed the water into 30-foot seas. The snowstorms obscured vision to a few hundred feet. The automated light and radio beacon at Whitefish Point failed due to a power outage. In constant radio contact with the freighter Arthur Anderson, following 10 miles behind, McSorley steered his ship blind in a gale of monstrous seas and howling hurricane-force winds. Stripped one by one of modern safety equipment and navigation tools, McSorley and his crew fought Superior for all they were worth. Some 20 miles from the safety of Whitefish Bay, the Fitzgerald's radio communications abruptly cut out, and she disappeared from radar. In the blink of an eye, Big Fitz and all aboard her had vanished. That night, there were no surfmen patrolling at Vermilion Point to see her distress. No keepers at the lighthouse at Whitefish Point to keep a signal lit. She had gone down like the first ships on the lake, in a blinding gale, wrapped in Superior's fury.
Lake Superior is an unforgiving lake. Lake Superior, as it represents Mother Nature, is a very, very unforgiving beast. And I don't care how big the ship is, I don't care how strong or how well designed. Superior, in a storm, can take the ship down. And that's a fear we always have to deal with. regardless of the marvels of modern technology.
The 29 men that went down with the Fitzgerald joined the thousands, both men and women, who fought or perished on Superior's waters.
The toll on human life on the Great Lakes is staggering. The numbers of ships that have gone down is astounding. There's been estimated to be anywhere between, at one extreme, 12,000 shipwrecks, and more realistically, probably 6,000 total losses. The numbers of lives lost associated with these disasters has been estimated at 30,000. Nowhere on the Great Lakes are these people collectively remembered in an appropriate memorial.
We have no idea their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, what their desires were, what their opportunities were, where they came from or where they were going. They simply have disappeared into the dustbin of history.
The only markers left are the people who served along the shipwreck coast, the lighthouses, the life-saving stations, and the wrecks, preserved in the cold, fresh waters of Superior, are but a small part of a much larger maritime history of the Great Lakes. For those who served and continue to serve, it is a legacy of endurance and determination, of daring and common brotherhood with all those who sail the Sweetwater seas.